Hello, I'm Morgan Peckman, Executive Director of New York Civic, and this is Candidate College. Top political consultants can cost tens of thousands of dollars each month to hire. Well, in this episode of Candidate College, you get the benefit of their expert advice for free. Moderator Doug Forand, the founding partner of Red Horse Strategies and one of the top political consultants in the business, sits down with his colleagues, some of the best and brightest in New York City, to tell you what you can do to be a successful candidate. I hope you enjoy.
What I wanted to do with this session, and why I'm glad we have such a good team up here, is really be almost a blast in the face of cold water for you all. That's some of the realities of campaigns and what you're about to put yourself through if you choose to run. Joining me is Patrick Jenkins, who I've had the privilege of working with several times, Democratic consultant. Roger Stone, who has a tremendous reputation on the Republican side. Emma Wolfe, who I've also worked with extensively. She's not a consultant, which I'm glad about because she'd be horrible competition. She is actually Chief of Staff for Public Advocate Bill de Blasio. And down on the end is Bradley Tusk, who has worked for both Democrats and Republicans and independents and run some tremendous campaigns. So I want to jump right into it, and I think the previous panel got to this somewhat, but I want to reemphasize this and just put it out there. If you all could, and we'll start with Patrick and work our way down. Tell everybody what a candidate's job is in a campaign environment.
Well, let's get started.
Good afternoon. A candidate's job, real simple. Be a candidate. Don't be a campaign manager. Don't be a pollster. Don't be well, you can be a strategist if you want in your free time. But for the most part, your job is to be a candidate. That means talk to voters. Talk to voters. And take care of your families who will have to support you through this whole process. But the key thing I can tell any candidate is to go and talk to voters. Express your opinions, be articulate, be smart, you're all of that. But it makes no difference if you're not talking to voters or talking to someone who can give you money, okay? And I won't take the whole mic over.
I'm going to echo what Patrick said. I mean, first of all, the greatest single mistake a candidate can make is trying to be the candidate and the campaign manager. Richard Nixon tried that in 1960, and it was a disaster. He was doing his own schedule. He was approving the advertising. He was approving the graphics. He was preparing himself for the debates, and we know how that worked out. 8 years later, he had a campaign manager who ran the campaign, and he focused on his performance on the stump. The single most important job for a candidate, in my view, particularly at the level of the races that you're talking about, asking for money. The secret to political fundraising is asking as many people as possible and being fearless about rejection. The candidate who won't ask for money is usually called a loser.
I'm not sure how to follow that. I think raise money, talk to voters. You are, especially on a local campaign, you are the only sort of commodity for your campaign. So you need to be out there rather than inside in a small office talking to the rest of your team.
Yeah, there's no real point in echoing the same thing everyone said, but I think there's consensus that, hire the right people and let them do their jobs and do what they do.
Thanks. And actually, we'll start with Brad, and this gets to the next question, which somebody was asking about at the close of the previous panel. What questions should these folks be asking of us when they're deciding who to hire? What should they say? What should they ask about? What information should they get?
Probably three things. The first is, how do you really see the path for this race specifically? I think the danger for people like us is it becomes a business, it becomes a commodity in a lot of ways. You're busy, you're trying to maximize and scale up, and as a result, you tend to apply the same approaches to lots of different problems. That doesn't necessarily work. It may work from a business standpoint for the consultant, but not necessarily for the candidates. You really want to see not just their resume, but their vision. Number two is, I would ask, who are your other clients and how much time do you have? I tell most candidates that call me, you don't want me because I don't have time for you. And it's just, you need someone, candidates are needy and campaigns are crazy and hectic. You need someone that really has time to devote to it. And even if their resume isn't as impressive, even if they haven't done as many big campaigns, you don't want a big name who can't focus on you. And third, it's got to be, their background has to be specific and appropriate to the race. There are people who are great on a national campaign and wouldn't know the first thing about running a district leader campaign and vice versa. And again, you've got to make sure that the right people for your campaign with the time to spend on it and with a specific plan for you.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I guess the only two things that I would add are find out about their record. And just like if you're interviewing somebody for a job, get their references of who they want you to call, but also call around to folks you trust and really try to get a broad understanding of how these folks are on campaigns with candidates that they've worked for.
Well, I'm going to echo what Brad said. First of all, if you are running for the assembly, then look for someone who has elected an assembly person. If you are running for the city council, look for someone who's elected someone to the city council. If you are running for governor, look for someone who has a track record of electing governors. There are different disciplines in presidential politics than there are in local politics, and therefore look for a track record of experience. And then secondarily, as Bradley also said, look for someone who has the time. There's a very prominent political consultant here in New York who I'm friendly with and I know very well. He's a Democrat, and he's a great salesman. And he sells, but he doesn't service the business that he does sign because he's too busy out selling. So you want somebody who is going to eat, sleep, and breathe your race, and therefore hasn't taken on too many races, and doesn't have the time to dedicate to your race. The other thing that often happens is you find that those types of consultants, if something works well in one race, they will then try the exact same thing in another race, which is fine if you're in two different states, but it doesn't work very well if you're in the same state, and really doesn't work well if you're in the same city. So you don't want somebody who is essentially repackaging the same campaign over and over and over again. For some reason, the phrase too liberal for too long comes to mind. It worked great in New York, doesn't work too well in Rhode Island. So you don't want a cookie cutter campaign. You want somebody who is got some big picture thinking, who can see the path to victory and explain it to you, and not somebody who is selling you a formula that worked elsewhere.
I don't know how to add to all of that. I think they're all right, but I do want to emphasize, find someone who can take you and articulate how they would project you to make people vote for you, and can formalize a strategy, a winning strategy that you can understand, that they can explain, but that can take the essence of you as a candidate and project that broad-based to voters.
Thanks. Yeah. The only thing that I would say is just to reemphasize Emma's point of checking references. If I, as a consultant, can't give you a list of happy clients, candidates who won races, then you shouldn't hire me, frankly. It's just that. And the other thing I would say is, if you ever sit down with a consultant and they tell you this is going to be easy, just get up and walk away. Just leave them right there. Don't even spend the money on the cup of coffee, because it is not worth it. Running for office is never easy. It's grueling. And so, with that, I want to sort of jump the list on the questions that I gave these guys. But I want to get into getting yourself prepared emotionally and psychologically for the race, and just put it to folks. What do people need to expect? I think the previous panel talked about the toll that it takes on your family, which is real. But what are other things that people going into this aren't really prepared for and should be prepared for? So, Patrick.
I think quite a few things you should try to prepare yourself for, and you're never really prepared. But one, prepare yourself for not everyone liking you. Everyone, you're not going to please everyone, and everyone is not going to support you, and everybody's not going to like you. Prepare yourself for a strong dose of rejection and reality. It happens, and it shouldn't discourage you, but you should just know. And I think a lot of times people think, if I have 5 minutes to talk to this person, they'll understand where I'm coming from, and they will support me because I'm right. And as a candidate, you should always know, do your best, go out there and try to win that vote, but everyone is not going to like you, so you should prepare yourself for hard days, long days, short nights of sleep, but but definitely prepare yourself for that rejection, and don't take people saying they support you for support.
I agree with everything Patrick said, and not to belabor any of that. If you have ever done anything that you're really embarrassed or ashamed about, if you have ever done something you'd really like everybody else not to know about, don't run for public office, or be prepared to have everyone know it. Now, it may or may not happen, but I'm often amazed at high-ranking politicians who do things that are self-destructive on the assumption that they've gotten so high up the ladder that nobody will know about it. Let me sum up the Wiener situation for you. Tweet your meat, lose your seat.
The question? What
Sorry about that.
What was the question?
Yeah, it's hard. What do people need to be prepared for emotionally?
Oh, right. Everything that these two gentlemen just said, the only things I would add are, I think with candidates, my experience with first-time candidates, if you're in a campaign that is going back and forth and going negative, is the first round of negatives that you get from the other side can sometimes be, at least momentarily, debilitating, because you've never walked up to a house to see your neighbor and they're holding a piece of mail there that says something very bad about you. So I think just sort of preparing for that and realizing it's just the first hit in a longer round, or whatever the boxing analogy is, that's important. I can't emphasize enough having a strong support system, everything that the previous elected officials were saying, but really having conversations with your friends and family before you declare running is incredibly important, because you're going to need those folks down the line. And then the other things I would say that are just sort of emotionally taxing on candidates, and that often folks don't think about because they're thinking about sort of the glitz of things, is the repetition, the constant grunt work of doing retail, talking to voters in the morning, talking to voters at night, getting on the phone and talking to donor after donor after donor. It's not glitzy at all. It's a lot of hard work. So it takes a minute, I think, for candidates to sort of emotionally adjust to that too.
Yeah, there's not too much more to add other than you take the last point that Emma just made. People often run for office, and I think most people kind of would agree with it, to fill an emotional need that they have, right? There's insecurity, they see their name in the newspaper, makes them feel better about themselves. And if that's why you're running for office, A, you better understand that about yourself. And B, if you're really smart, you should recognize that and not run for office. But this is not a glamorous business. There's occasionally a cool event or a great newspaper story, but I think Eric or someone in the last panel talked about handing out flyers outside of wall bounds. That's what most of this is. And even if you ask, major politicians, national politicians, senators, governors, big mayors, even presidential candidates, they'll still tell you it's a grind. So you really understand psychologically why you're running for office in the first place, and if it's purely to sort of make yourself feel better about yourself, if you can have the sort of discipline to realize that and not run, you should.
I want to shift a little bit in tone. I mean, one of the conversations that I've had with candidate after candidate is about the use of negative campaigning. And we all meet folks, and I'm sure we've all had this conversation, where you sit down with somebody and they say, I want to run a positive, issues-oriented campaign. I don't want to go negative. I want this to be all about why I should be elected. So I want to put it to you, other than potentially goodbye, what do you say to these candidates? Or you're going to lose?
I just really want to hear Roger answer that.
Well, I know very little about negative campaigning. In all honesty, I would say 50% of the time you have the opposite problem, which is your candidate says, okay, when are we going to go negative? I mean, first of all, this has got to be dictated by your survey research. It's not a gut decision. It doesn't have to be a piece of every campaign. It doesn't. There are occasionally campaigns that you can win by outpointing the other candidate on positive issues. It's not necessarily a requirement, but because we've all seen the devastating negative mail pieces in television commercials, and we've heard the radio commercials, we all assume that it's a stock piece of every campaign, which is not necessarily the case. And then also, there's the level at which it's going to be administered. I mean, I have been in situations in which my mail was comparative, negative if you will, while the electronic media stayed positive, and you were only focusing some subsets of the voters with negative message to move them from here to there. So I guess the best answer to the question is when I sit with a candidate who does not want to do negative, I then take the poll and outline why I believe it will work and why it's a necessity. Or in contrast, sometimes I will take the poll and show here's why we shouldn't go negative and why it will hurt us more than it hurts our opponent.
I was just going to add that if you're a candidate who does not want to go negative, it's incumbent, I actually think it's incumbent upon you to have that conversation with your consultant early on, and if the consultant is good, they'll also talk to you about the fact that there's going to have to be negative campaigning, if there is in that race. But it should be a decision made well ahead of time, certainly not in the final throes of the campaign, in the final weeks when the mail is supposed to be going out the door. So I don't think that completely answers the question, other than to say that you need to have the conversation and flesh it out before you really start your campaign.
Yeah, and I think that's all totally right. And look, if the desire not to go negative is somehow synonymous with someone with a more policy-minded, kind of loftier ambitions and goals to do good, then really that person think about, do I really need to serve in elected office in the first place, right? Because I think most of us will tell you that a high-ranking appointed executive branch position in almost any form of government is going to be vastly more powerful and get a lot more done than being an elected legislator. So if your goal is, hey, I just want to do the right thing and I just want to be positive and get stuff done, go get a job in government. And you can do a lot of good for a long time. And if that's, quite frankly, in many ways more admirable than, quite frankly, running for office. But understand that about yourself again and listen to yourselves.
All right. As you all know, if you're running for office, you're going to be raising money, and raising money is just a miserable process. It's a lot of rejection. It's a lot of just grueling, sitting on the phone, calling. What's particularly painful for me is when I see a candidate who then raises money and proceeds to waste it on stupid expenditures. And so I want to put it out to this panel. What are the dumb ways that candidates frequently spend money? We'll start with Patrick on this one.
Have I seen it? Man, there's a lot. But honestly, unnecessary, it's all about timing with spending money. Every penny is critical. And if your pennies are not used to get a message out to a voter, it's usually not, it's not all the time well spent. But sometimes I would say a lot of campaign infrastructure that people seem to think that they need, especially on local races, are usually overwhelming. I've seen people with really exotic offices and signs and T-shirts and posters, and way too early, way before their name ever appeared on a ballot. And if it didn't have a useful purpose, it usually was a waste of money. Typically, it's also an indication when you have to do that someone maybe was not able to lend you space, a local business owner, or to give you a small desk to bring in the 3 volunteers that you have, to give them material to go out. So I would argue that a lot of unnecessary campaign infrastructure is bought very early, spent very early, before you've done anything to project a message to voters. So I would urge you to be very, very judicious in how you use it.
This is an excellent question. I guess there's a couple different parts. First of all, I think you judge every expenditure in a campaign on one simple question. Will this win me votes? Will this win the campaign votes? T-shirts do not win votes. Yard signs, the bane of my existence, do not win votes. Now, that said, I did a campaign in the parliamentary elections in the Ukraine 2 cycles ago. It was very exciting, it was very interesting. But I must tell you that in the Ukraine, I am known as the father of the yard sign. I introduced the yard sign. Comrade, put name on side, put in the yard is genius, genius. It maybe worked because no one had ever seen a yard sign before. So it was innovative for that country. But generally, I think campaigns waste a lot of money on things that aren't vote productive. So count backwards from election day. plot out your mail and how you're going to pay for it. That's first, particularly at the level you're talking about. Plot out your phone calls and how you're going to pay for it. Then overlay, if you have the money, your electronic communications. And then, and only then, figure out what your overhead ought to be, which ought to be the smallest amount of money you spend. Office space doesn't win you votes. Storefronts, particularly, don't win you votes. Candidates running for the city council, for the assembly, don't really need a headquarters, in my opinion. I'd rather see that money go into some kind of communication that wins votes. I think that any campaign has a few resources. Money is one, and time is the other. Anytime a campaign is squandering either one of them, they're headed for defeat.
I don't think I have too much to add other than just plain and simple. If you're in a local race, you're probably going after a few thousand votes. Everything that you're spending money on, as these gentlemen have said, should be about targeted and effective voter contact and communication. So that's either a mail piece, a phone call, a door knock. But if you're really excited about communicating to hundreds of thousands of people because of the billboard that's going to go up or the big sign at the parade or whatever it is, and you're really excited because it is so many people that you're communicating to, they are not voting in your race. So it doesn't matter. It's money not well spent.
All right. Polling is one of those things obviously we all do, and it's very, very instructive for races. What your gut tells you people are talking about, you may be shocked to find out is not true. But on the other side, we also see from that candidates who want to poll in the final week of a campaign when they actually can't change what they do. So when should campaigns poll, and when should they not poll? Let's start.
Sure. Wow. Campaign polling in local races is an extravagant expense. Mm-hmm. The best poll for you to have is taking stock of your community and taking stock of the district and having a good idea of what those district issues are. I'm hard pressed, and I think I've yet to see a poll in an assembly race, any of the assembly races that I've run, except honestly, I've seen polls to discourage candidates, but I've never seen a poll done by candidates on local races. The expense for polling is overwhelming. So I don't know of a reason, unless you're going for Congress or even state Senate, Congress, and above for polling.
All right, well, we have our first area of disagreement. Running a campaign without taking a poll is like driving a car with your eyes closed. You will go forward, but you have no idea what you might hit. If you can't afford a poll and you're running for the assembly, you shouldn't be running for the assembly. Because it is from that document that all of your targeting will come, all of your messaging will come. There will invariably be issues that you think are popular in your community but aren't because of your perception. It's very hard for first-time candidates particularly for them to leave their preconceived notions at the door. Oh, my district is overwhelmingly pro-choice. Well, maybe not. There are a lot of assumptions in politics that people around the process make. Now, I think, pardon me, that's mine. Patrick's right about the fact that I'm going to let it roll. He's right about the fact that it's more difficult to do at the local level because your universe is much smaller, and therefore getting a good sample and getting a good feel at a level in which, in all honesty, most people don't know their assemblymen. Most people don't know their city councilmen, and they're even less aware of city issues and state issues than they are of federal issues. So it's more difficult to poll, but I think the net result is an absolute necessity. Otherwise, you could be centering your campaign around issues that don't work. You could be centering your campaign around emphasizing things that aren't winning you votes.
For what it's worth, I think my answer would probably be somewhere in between. I don't know any council or assembly races ever that have been ever able to afford a large, serious sort of benchmark poll from a firm. But I do think that there are ways where you can get your volunteers out your team out to do sort of, it's called hard ID or blind ID, where you basically just talk to 100 voters in your district and ask them a few questions, get the results, and it gives you a basic understanding of where voters are at. It's not scientific, but I do find it helpful, especially on really, really local races. And certainly I would only do that with people who can really analyze the data with you if you have a good team on board.
Yeah, I generally agree with Roger in that I do think you've got to set the benchmark and know what the path is. I will say that even in somewhat smaller dollar races, there's polling, there's micro-targeting, there's ad testing. I'm working on an IE right now in a small race in Michigan that a client cares a lot about. And I had enough money to either poll or micro-target, and I chose to micro-target because I felt like it's going to be a very low turnout, very field-driven race. And if I could find a couple of thousand households who none of the other IEs were going to think to contact, and I could door knock them and nail them and call them and pull them out, that's probably enough to win the election. So, I think when you ask yourself that question, it's should we poll or not? My view, and again, I've been lucky to just work on campaigns with a lot of money where I don't have to make all these choices, but it's, yes, you should poll when you can. But between polling and micro-targeting and ad testing, they give you different pros and cons. In some ways, in the smaller races, a good micro-targeter that can do it cost-effectively and give you a really good list of households that you could then target may be a lot more useful than having a broad-based sense of where the district stands on an issue.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and I will say, I mean, I actually come down more with Roger on this one. If you can't raise the money for a poll, you probably shouldn't be running. And frankly, I know on the Democratic side, with assembly candidates who look to run, the Democratic Assembly Campaign Committee won't talk to you until you've raised enough money for a poll. And then they're going to make you do it. And again, if it shows a path to victory, then you can go back and try and get support there. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. And that's that. And so, but it is, again, you don't want to be extravagant. You don't want to waste money. I do agree with Brad in that if you can get a good micro-target, in some cases, that can be just as effective as a poll and give you a good snapshot of the district and give you the added benefit of knowing where else you can go outside of sort of the target universe that you may have already conceptualized to find the voters that you need.
Let me address the second part of your question, because I really didn't. When you should poll. At the beginning, because it is the document on which you'll base all your assumptions going forward. And then, if you have the money, I would recommend polling 10 days to a week out while there's still time to do something with the information. Candidates who poll the final weekend to find out whether they're going to win or lose should be using that money to try to win. And it obviously differs state to state. We now have a situation in Florida where we have early voting. The polls open 8 days in advance. Also, we're finding that almost a third of our voters are now voting by absentee. So you have to begin everything in your campaign much earlier. I'm not sure the early voting is a good idea. I'm glad to see that they're not doing it here, but on the other hand, New York does enough things wrong that it doesn't matter. But polling for your prurient interest is a waste of money.
All right, thanks. With that, I actually want to turn it over to you all and see what questions folks have for the panel. So start with you in the middle. Yes.
Thanks. John McCoy, thanks for having me. I hope this folks can answer some other questions. I just have two. One is, how early would you be thinking about getting a consultant for a candidacy or for a run? And the second is, do consultants also help in issues where if you've been on a staff with someone else in that certain district, do you work with kind of your volunteers from your old base, or do you look at where their affinities politically might lie? I mean, are those issues also addressed by consultants in terms of where to get volunteers from your base? You kind of get. So the first was just how early, and the second is where do you choose?
Sure. I mean, I'll take a first whack at this one. Look, I think from the minute you are looking at running seriously, you should be talking to consultants. There should be people willing to talk to you who do campaigns at your level. Again, you don't want to put them on retainer right away, because then you're losing money. And part of the conversation with them should be about what they're looking to make off the race and how you're going to pay them. Because we're all in business. This is what we do, except Emma, who actually gets the paycheck. So there's that. As far as volunteers, cast the net as broadly as you possibly can. There should be no limit to who you go to on that. If you have somebody that you have a connection to, you should be asking them to help, and you should be asking them for money. Everybody. So with that, I'll let folks have things they want to add.
The only thing I would say is my favorite quote from Dwight Eisenhower: "Plans are worthless, but planning is indispensable." The earlier you can start planning, the better. Now, that doesn't mean you have to start paying, but if you're watching the national campaign unfold with Rick Perry, one of the largest problems here is there is no planning. They're just jumping ahead. There's no structure, there's no planning, and it shows. It's starting to show. At any level, finite planning of your campaign. My other favorite quote from Frank Hague: "Plan your work and work your plan."
All right, you, Patrick.
How would you advise a candidate like a guy from Wills, who just got reelected to city council, with his previous problems in terms of his work as a construction person? Like you mentioned before, if you knew that you've done something that you don't want anyone to know about, stay out of politics. How would you advise somebody like him?
I'm not familiar enough with this situation. So.
Yeah. Brad, you want to take that?
I think it's really, look, he won, right? He got reelected, which is, you've got to sense whether or not what you have done wrong matters to the voters, right? I'll give you a corollary. So, Illinois 2003, 2006, I worked for Rod Blagojevich. He was running for re-election. At the time, already was being investigated by the feds, but phenomenal politician, lunatic, but phenomenal politician. And the question that we sort of asked ourselves, realized pretty quickly, was in Illinois, voters define corruption as money going in your pocket. And at least at that point, he had been accused of that. And as a result, everything out there, as negative as it seemed, was not getting through to the voters. And our opponent didn't understand that. All she did was focus on the investigations, when there really were real-life pocketbook issues you could have hit us on that would have been a lot worse. Our electricity commission voted to raise rates like 100%. You know, traffic on the Dan Ryan was a disaster. There were all kinds of ways where I thought we were actually vulnerable to real people. And I knew that we weren't on this particular issue because I understood where the voters stood on it. As a result, they never really were able to make any headway at all. So I think the question is, you've got to somehow figure out, is whatever it is that you've done wrong important to the voters? If it is, you got a problem. If it's not, then just do your thing.
Yeah, I mean, and with Councilman Wills, look, I mean, his
Sorry, Doug, can you speak in the
Sorry. Yeah, with Councilman Wills, his problems have already been made public, right? So he's going into this with an electorate that has seen this. You have to presume that he went retail instead and just talked to people directly, and clearly those issues were not enough to overcome it. Now, again, he was running against a divided field, limited resources. In one case, one of his opponents had far deeper problems with the electorate than he did. So in a different world, if he had a different opponent, maybe it could have been an issue. But again, like whatever it is, if it's out there, it's out there. And you just got to deal with it and try and build your campaign around the message that works.
Let me just add briefly, because that's my district where I live, so just to watch how he did it, he did his job every day. And if I would have advised him to go out and do your job every day and stand up for the issues and let other people talk about those other issues. But he went out and did his job every day and was in the community newspapers every week, playing with kids, doing the things, and it worked out for him.
All right, you in the front.
Hi, I have two questions, and I'll ask them first, then you can answer, okay? The first question is could you ballpark us on about how much we're looking to spend when we hire a consultant, and how that payment plan is structured? And the second thing I wanted to ask was, in particular, Brad and also Roger, when it comes to polling. I ran for city council. Whenever we were out there campaigning or at events, I also gave out papers, slips of papers, asking them what was the most important problem in the community. But now we're talking about, I assume, with polling, telephone work. Do you think that this could be done in a less expensive way through just simply having people call from their homes, volunteers calling from their home telephones, just asking what's the most important? Okay, he's saying yes and you're saying no. So can I get an opinion from both of you about what is the best way and most cost-effective way to do a polling?
You want to take the first part first or the second part first?
Why don't we start? We'll start with the first part. Look, I mean, every consultant that you talk to may have a different fee structure. There's nothing universal about this, and it's going to depend on the services that you're asking them for. There are times when we go in, and depending on the size of the district and the amount of time that it's going to take for us, for our firm, and we set a retainer based on that. And then your consultants also make money on the mail and the other services that they provide. So there are times when we don't charge a retainer because it doesn't make sense in the context of the overall campaign. So it's hard to give a ballpark. But think about it in the context of your overall budget, right? If you're running for city council and you're capped at $162,000 and you're spending $40,000 on your consultant, that's ridiculous. You're spending 25% of your budget on things that don't actually let you communicate with your voters. So that would be my.
That's a comprehensive.
If that's what you're doing, again, others may come to you with a proposal that's different. So you really have to sit down with each one.
I would just tag team along with Doug on that one to say that I think you should just make a really simple spreadsheet, and there's like 4 or 5 categories: infrastructure, keeping the lights on, this kind of thing, voter contact, voter communication, legal, petition collection, I don't know, data, and that's kind of it. And you should be really clear about it, and it's helpful as you're adding up the dollars. What are the percentages next to these categories? You'll very quickly see if something's out of whack there if you're spending 30% on your attorneys or something like this.
On the second question on polling, I think Roger made the point earlier that if you can't raise enough money to field a poll, you probably shouldn't be running in the first place. It's great to get anecdotal data from the people, from voters. You can use social media very cheaply and effectively to do that. You could do that in the field. However, if you believe you need at least one poll, and I think you do, to put together a viable campaign plan, you need a statistically valid sample that is done the right way that gives you a real snapshot of your district and of your voters. And I just don't think getting pieces of paper in the shopping centers is going to do that for you.
So what would you say the right way is to do it?
I think you hire a real pollster and you go into the field. Now look, you can have a smaller sample, you could have a shorter survey. Some pollsters cost more than others. I don't think you have to necessarily have the most expensive pollster out there. Agreed. But I do think that it's a scientific document, and if you don't do it the right way, I don't think it's worth much. When you hire a really big name pollster, you'll do it often for things like, and I do this a lot for corporations even more than candidates, I want to leak it to the press, I want to show it to certain elected officials to influence their thinking. So I need a really big name because I'm buying their name in essence and that credibility. If you just want data, and that's what you need, then there are a lot of people who can do that for a lot less, who are, who can get the math. Writing the survey is not that hard. The call center itself is not that expensive. So think about why you're polling. Now, if you're trying to poll to box out the rest of the field, then you may want a name. If you're polling to really understand where things stand, it still has to be statistically significant and valid, but it can be a lot cheaper.
All right, yeah, right.
Sure. So we know that turnout in primaries is anemic in most races. But when people run, they ideally want to bring new people into the process. So I guess my question is, how naive is it to think you're going to turn out primary voters who aren't regular primary voters? And have you ever had success stories in that area?
You want to try? I mean, it's actually fairly naive. To be blunt, people who don't vote don't vote. It's just a truism. That being said, you can expand beyond the core universe of previous primary voters, obviously with new voters whose behavior you don't know. And then if you find people who haven't voted in primaries but with a solid general election voting history, they may be worth adding in. But beyond that, your money is going to be limited, so you should just really focus on the people who are with a proven history. Anyone?
I think sometimes a highly ideological candidacy can bring out expanded numbers. Look at the Republican primary between Carl Palladino and Rick Blasio in Western New York. Erie County voted 80%, and they voted 80% for the hometown boy. That very rarely happens, but it does in a highly charged ideological candidacy. Generally speaking, though, I see a lot of campaigns decide, well, we're going to go out and register new voters. People who are not registered for a reason. They don't care. They're not interested. And even if you are fortunate enough to get them to fill out a card, now getting them to polls or getting them to fill out an absentee is like pulling teeth. So you do need to fish within the pool of registered voters as it exists. I do think primary turnout can be expanded with a lot of targeting and a lot of hard work and a very pointed message. It is even harder in a general election.
Are you the social media expert that your candidates turn to? And if not, who do you turn to get your expertise on those new tools that have evolved in the last 5 years?
First of all, I have trouble opening my own email. But I have people who work for me, most of them are 30 years younger than I am, who are wizards at this. So it's finding talented people who understand the disciplines and applications of social media is not that hard. And you help them bring a more political application to it. But it's coming. I mean, by the time I end my career, and I'm kind of like Hyman Roth, I intend to live forever, the post office will close because there'll be no purpose for it anymore. We're almost there. And voter mail, as we know it, will be a thing of the past because it's all going to be done online. And as soon as New York State requires an email address when you register to vote, which would make the entire system more efficient, and that you update that if you happen to change your email address, because I change mine like I change suits, you'd have a more efficient system. Today, if you match the average voter list to email, you'd be lucky to get a 20% match. You'd be happy with a 20% match, because it means you can reach 20% of the voters extremely cheaply. So I really think as we move into an age of mass communication, into a greater age of mass communication, social media will change political communication the way cable television changed political communication. What it means is 1,000 gross rating points of TV in New York, which used to be a lot of television, isn't a lot of television anymore. When I did Tom Kaine's race for governor of New Jersey in 1985, I was putting up 600-800 gross rating points of television and thinking it was a heavy buy. In those days, it was. And it did move voters from A to B. Today, it's a drop in the bucket.
I just realized. Hi, Doug. Sorry. The one thing I would say, Charles, and I'm not sure if this is answering your question still, is for local campaigns, if you're working with, and you have a small team, you have a campaign manager in your team, and there's somebody who's interested in social media, just like there's somebody interested in registering new voters, you may not want to make your campaign plan and your strategy to win built around either of those operations. But if there's an energy for it, then set up your online and new media committee, have somebody go doing new registration. You've got good folks with good energy doing stuff, and it'll get you maybe 100, 200 votes that way. But set up a committee.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is don't set something up just to set something up. If you have a Facebook page and you have 7 friends on it, you look like an idiot. Right? So if you're going to do these things, make sure that you're going to put in enough effort to make it viable and meaningful and positive for your campaign.
Skeletons in the closet. With John Edwards, he had skeletons galore. It was just like he was a bone house. Yet nothing came out until quite late. And with Charlie Rangel, we were running against him. He had so many, everybody knew his skeletons, and yet it made no difference. So even though, given what was said before, I don't see, and with Newt Gingrich, he's got skeletons supposedly with multiple marriages, and yet that seems to be a big deal, whereas other people have multiple marriages, and it doesn't make a difference. So how do you determine where the skeletons can be unburied, or kept buried, or reburied, or never buried?
I would assume that nothing can be kept buried.
Yeah. John Edwards did.
Right, you might get lucky. Look, you can cross the street with your eyes closed and maybe you won't get hit by a bus. Right? But it doesn't make it a good idea. So if you've got something out there, assume that somebody's going to be able to do the research and dig it up. I mean, the depth of information that's available on the internet right now is astounding.
But I looked at Charlie Rangel. Our campaign was hoping we had a good candidate, and we had on the opposition side, we had a candidate that was rife with malfeasance.
Unique nature of the district. Okay. Any other district, he would be a retired congressman right now. And if he lived in another state, he'd be in prison right now.
I mean, and look, I mean, you have Chris Lee and Anthony Weiner had to resign. You have David Vitter down in Louisiana, didn't. Right? I mean, it is unique to each district. But again, I would just live under the assumption if you've got something bad out there, it's going to come up. Yeah, that's true. All right. Other question? Back there?
I had a question for you guys about first-time candidates. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about advice that you might have about some basics like when you advise it's the right time to jump in a particular race, where you should be thinking about running, and what office you might to go if that's the right kind of office.
The where and for what is really dependent on you and why you're running. And if you're running because you want to be elected in some capacity and don't really care where, it's going to be a little harder to shape a campaign message around that. It's like, I want to run for something. I think Gustavo Rivera was saying, like, if you're running because you want honorable in front of your name, don't bother. Go become a notary and call yourself honorable. You'll be fine. The when to get in is, frankly, as soon as you can. Look, you have a limited amount of time in which to raise money and start meeting voters and put together your base of support. So I don't think you want to hesitate on that. Obviously, going into the next year, if you're looking at state legislative races, we don't really know what those districts are going to look like exactly. So that makes it a little more problematic for choosing to get involved. But that doesn't mean you can't set up a committee. You can set up a committee with the State Board of Elections that's undesignated and start raising money. It doesn't mean you can't start figuring out who are your volunteers, who are your supporters, who are the people that you can talk to, and then as you see how the lines come down, you make your decision at that point. It's very easy to stop a campaign if it doesn't make sense to continue. You just stop. Other things to add there?
That's good.
That's best.
All right.
How do you become a consultant?
I'm sorry, we're full.
Yeah, I mean, look, you hang out a shingle. If somebody pays you, you're a consultant. That's it.
How important is field as it compares to the cost as it compares to phones or mail or anything?
I mean, look, in local races especially, I think field is a critical component of your voter contact plan. It's depending on what kind of race you're going in. In a special election, the importance of field is dramatically magnified. But even in a primary where you anticipate low turnout, field is critical. And if you're not, and you can't make the mistake, as I would argue the weapon campaign did, of thinking that strong GOTV is the same thing as a real field operation. It's not. It's got to be incorporated from the beginning, and your messaging on field needs to be integrated with your messaging on mail, phones, or if you're doing TV, which most of you should not do, or probably all of you. But again, it's got to be part of the same overall messaging strategy. Anyone else want to?
The only thing is, of the communication types, it's the least controllable. In other words, particularly if you're relying on volunteers. You do mail, once you drop it at the post office, you know that it will arrive. You pay for phone calls, you know they're going to get made, assuming you have a reliable vendor or you're overseeing your volunteers. Your field operation is critical, but if you are relying solely on volunteers, you're going to learn pretty quickly that volunteers have a life.
What about a paid canvas?
Paid canvas, if you can afford it, I think it, in combination with those other things, it's very important and needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, on all the races where Emma and I have worked together, I don't think we've ever done one without paid canvas.
Right. And a paid canvas, I've been on campaigns I've come in late on campaigns where the campaign has said we've got 15,000 yeses for this race that only needs like 2,000 votes. And it's great, here you go. And those yeses that they got were not real because they had an army of folks who were volunteering and it was very nice and maybe the person opened the door and that person became a yes or they weren't confirmed or whatever it is. So a quality field campaign, absolutely. But I agree, a lot of effort, a sort of half-hearted, volunteer only canvas operation, that's a lot tougher.
Back here.
Has anyone ever won a race without a consultant?
Sure. I mean, and you can do it again, like.
We just don't recommend it.
Right.
Let me just say, my first race was an assembly race in the late 90s, and it was myself and 12 people and an incumbent with not much money. But And so we didn't have a consultant, we just had, I wasn't a consultant yet. I guess, yeah, I don't even think I got paid for that. So I wasn't a consultant yet. So it was a campaign manager, 12 good volunteers, and a highly targeted race, in an assembly race that had turnout of about a total of 5,000 people. And I think we were very effective in turning out a vote. So we didn't have, you don't always need a consultant, but you do need a game plan. You do need a game plan.
Yeah. Look, you need someone who knows what they're doing, and so whether that's a paid consultant or if you have a friend who actually is in the business, or you have a really smart, experienced campaign manager who basically acts as a consultant, those are all viable options. And we like to be consultants on races because then we can actually make the races successful and make sure that the stuff that we know needs to happen is happening. So back here, yeah, you in the black. Yep.
Roger talked about matching voter lists to email lists that you can get from, I guess, vendors. Have you used unsolicited email in the past? If you do, what kind of a response rate did you get from it? What, just in general?
It's very tricky because while it's true that the federal spam laws prohibit you from commercial blasting, supposedly political communication is excluded, is waived. The problem, of course, is that Google or Yahoo have a hard time discerning what's political communication and what's commercial. So you're going to have a relatively high bounce rate anyway. And if your opponent's on his toes, his or her toes, then they're going to go file a complaint to try to get you shut down, get your servers shut down. You have to be able to move servers quickly, which is what we do. And you're constantly, even though you're entitled to blast unsolicited, unverified for political communications, you're not going to get through. I have generally found that it's additive. I would never choose to do, if I had a financial choice, I would never choose to do email voter blasting over voter mail yet. That day will come, but we're not there yet. Also, in any poll I take, I always determine who in the community is not online. You'd be surprised how many people are not online, particularly older voters, and therefore you're completely missing them. It's also no secret that hardline telephones are becoming a thing of the past, and therefore people with an actual hardline phone in their home tend at this point to be older voters who don't carry a cell phone or carry it only as a secondary. But the number of voters with a hardline phone, particularly in minority communities, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore you can't reach that many people. So I think you have to look at your communication mix, and really you're piecing it together to try to figure out how between postal mail, email, text messaging, which is about to come into its own, where you can text message voters based on an email on a phone number match, cell phone number match, and the more traditional modes of communication all need to be a part of your mix. None of them are perfect, none of them are 100%, and that's why, in essence, you need all of them. And to the extent that one voter turns on the radio, hears your commercial, goes to their mailbox, gets their mail, sits down, and after dinner they get a call from your campaign, that's synergy. That's what you're seeking. Because the secret to every campaign is repetition. One of the questions that you had pointed out was, which I thought was the best question on your list, was how many message points can a candidate have in a typical campaign? Well, the real answer is as few as possible, based on the survey research. Because in the current age, where you have cable television with 90 channels, broadcast television with another 10, where you have magazines on every subject in the world, voters are being bombarded with information, and therefore it takes greater repetition on your part to just communicate one simple idea, which is really what a campaign is all about. There's a book which I really highly recommend, which is probably 30 years old right now, entitled Confessions of an Advertising Man by David Ogilvy. It's a small volume. It's still in print. You can order it from Amazon. It's called Confessions of an Advertising Man. And I would draw your attention to two chapters particularly. One entitled How to Write Potent Copy, and the other one is how to design a poster. They're both, the entire book is well worth reading. It was written about commercial advertising, but everything in the book is applicable to politics. And I can say that this book changed my life, and it will change yours.
We'll go over here.
My name is Timothy Schilling, and I happen to have lived both in the 10th and the 15th Congressional District. And my question is, I'm really concerned about what I'm hearing from Roger in terms of your predictions about forthcoming communication being primarily electronic, especially when you're communicating to older and minority voters. And the fact that we haven't yet talked about all of these other new Americans to bring on board, in particular Southeast Asians, we're seeing a rise of them. And as consultants, I feel like most of you have never had to really target to those kinds of groups, whether it's the emerging Latino group, the emerging East, Southeast Asian, Chinese, etc. And America has never had to think about that audience. And how do we now think about the media mix to market to them? Are you guys only targeting, for instance, like minority newspapers and things in language-based issues, or what is the mix? And I'm asking that because I'm concerned as someone that lives in these communities, thinking about how that's really going to disenfranchise the population that I would like to serve.
Let me answer it from standpoint one. We target voters, right? We target people who vote, people who tend to vote. And it's different than targeting or getting a message out to a community per se, or a group. So it's two different things. And for example, I was district director for a congressman who represents the largest South Asian community in the country, in Southeast Queens. And when he had a primary, and this was actually in the early 2000s when he had a primary. And in that primary, when we did the numbers on that district, there just were not that many voters in that district. So, not that we didn't campaign there ever, or that we didn't pay attention to it, but there was a recognition during a campaign cycle that there were very few voters in that district. So as consultants,
they're changing.
They
are changing.
You make this analysis with every single election, and you make a new analysis with every single election. But I'm just saying, the difference is not targeting a message toward a community per se, but when we're targeting voters, we're targeting voters, and that's an important thing to know.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I've done a number of races in Queens in some of the very, very diverse areas there, and we do understand the communities, and there is growing political power in those communities. And look, campaigns gravitate towards power bases. That's what we do. So as those communities as the citizenship numbers go up and the voter registration numbers go up, and they become more powerful, they naturally draw in the political apparatus there. And sometimes you can accelerate that through a campaign. But for us, it's a matter of understanding the community and understanding how to reach into that community. They're different. With the South Asian community, I did Joe Adavo's campaign a couple of times. I sent him to every Sikh temple I could get him to, and he went in and met with people and talked to them, and other community centers, religious centers. And it was also a matter of we do. We're as a firm, we focus very heavily on field operations in those local races. So we had a South Asian organizer out there working out, making sure that we're touching the community leaders and reaching out beyond them. So it's there, and it happens. I think, frankly, the campaigns that don't do that, they end up losing because they don't engage those communities. Weapon, yeah. I mean, I actually spoke to a South Asian political organizer that I know in the run-up to election day, and she said nobody had reached out to the community from the Weapon campaign, and it's like you can't, especially in a special election, you can't ignore constituencies like that or the Latino community. And then there was this one thing at the end where the campaign was like, oh, we're doing Spanish language and Chinese language messaging. Well, it's like the Asians in that district are not Chinese. Asian doesn't mean Chinese. Asian can mean any of a broad range of things. It's like, good for you. You're doing Chinese messaging. Maybe you should take it to Flushing, where people actually you have a much higher percentage of Chinese residents.
I think part of the answer is to move backwards and look at the older methods of campaigning as being more effective. In other words, you are not going to reach a lot of these emerging communities by email. You're not going to reach them by telephone. So you have to reach them at their doorstep. It's labor intensive, it's people intensive. It's really going back to the way politics used to work. So it's, if you don't have an organization or a structure that can do face-to-face voter contact, there's no other way to reach those people. Obviously, you can schedule large town meeting type events, which can be very effective in terms of drawing in, hearing what they have to say, telling what you have to say. But I really think it boils down to shoe leather. That's the single best way. Figure out where geographically they live and hit every door.
But I mean, based on your prediction, I think it's going to be something that may easily disenfranchise people if the state requires for people to have an email address.
No, the email just allows us greater efficiency to reach the people who do have email, but it doesn't mean you ignore those who don't. If you do so at your own peril. In other words, I wouldn't ignore senior citizens, even though most of them are not wired. They're not on the net, but they're too large a segment of the electorate to reach. So I hope to reach them by mail, I hope to reach them by phone, but if I fail on both of those, then I need to reach them door to door. I don't think you can ever write off any segment of the electorate just because they may be somewhat more difficult to reach.
All right.